First, thank you so much. I mean, your work is incredible to me. I feel so honored to be in this conversation. And Reem and I communicate often, and so we'll do our best to say everything and not just sort of like reference things that we've already talked about. Yeah. So this piece, Cleanse, thank you so much for all the kind things you said about it. The work was very important to me. I did the performance when I first found out I was pregnant, and I had the unfortunate experience of witnessing my mother's violent death when I was very young, and it sort of got buried in sort of the effort to live life and to be present. And also, we just had no photos of my mother growing up. It was very traumatic for everybody. But when I found out I was pregnant and being very aware of intergenerational trauma and sort of the effects of it, I really had to address that. And the thing that kept coming up for me was the first time I went back to my mother's homeland and I met her brother, and he said that the most painful thing about losing his sister was that they didn't get a chance to wash her body before she was buried. She was buried very quickly. And so that is part of the tradition, and it's not just anybody washing her body, it's her family washing her body, and they didn't get that chance. And it kept coming back up for me, and right before I decided to do Cleanse, it was really sort of, I hit a realization that the grief is really, the hardest part about grief is the loss of chances to love the person you love, to perform acts of endearment and kindness to them. And so I couldn't go back in time and wash my mother, but I could offer that kindness to something else. So this space was going to be knocked down, and I really wanted to offer it to a space that had either recently been knocked down or somewhere that was going to be knocked down. It felt appropriate to do a space that was about to be knocked down because, as you can see, it's perfectly fine, but it was going to be demolished for, it's been years and it's still like a pile of rubble. So this was in Oahu. It's called Ward Warehouse. It was called Ward Warehouse. And so, yeah, I was very recently pregnant during the performance. I'm very lucky. One of my documenters is here with us. Thank you so much for being here. And so it was Emily and her brother and myself in the space. And really every act of cleaning, I was just thinking of her and really trying to be present. And performance art is I'm such an empath and I feel everything in my body. And so it really was sort of what was needed for this act. And it was sort of a way of passing time and also passing time mindfully, and also just sort of like letting go. I could talk forever about this.
Well, through our conversations, one of the things that we had discussed was the act of saying goodbye.
Yes.
And I had mentioned that I wasn't able to properly say goodbye to my grandmother, who had been buried in a cemetery in Beirut. And then with a particularly bad session of Israeli bombardment, the whole cemetery was demolished, completely, destroyed. And so, we asked ourselves, we asked the question, well, where are her bones? And I can't go visit her, I can't go see her, I can't go pay my respects to her. And that's something that really still haunts me quite a bit. And I think it's so nice to talk to Nanci because we don't feel like we have to explain ourselves to one another. Yeah. So there's a great deal of ease that comes with that. And we don't feel like we have to apologize for being who we are. So, yeah. And this is another piece that also spoke a lot to me. One of Nanci's pieces, necrophobia, dead things.
Yeah.
I remember seeing this piece, and I remember thinking that it's coupled with a dress of a small child. So tell me a little bit about that.
So, as we mentioned, I'm born and raised in Nigeria, in rural southeastern Nigeria, and we left that space even before we left Nigeria to move to the U.S. And so, some years back, I went and visited with my sister, and we found like an old trunk of clothes in my grandmother's house where I used to live with my mother. This was my mother, my grandmother, and I on this compound. And in it was this dress, and this is one of my old dresses. This is a dress from the time period when she passed. And I always had a lot of guilt about not being, I mean, we'll talk a lot about guilt too. I mean, survivor's guilt is such a powerful force, but I had a lot of guilt about not protecting her. And I still do. It's interesting. I said that, and immediately I felt it. And it's interesting because now I recognize the parts of my body that react to certain things, certain concepts and memories of just concepts and memories. But I remember seeing the dress, and it just sort of was a moment where it was like, oh, I was tiny, There's no way that I could have protected her, if that makes sense. And so, and also during that period was sort of when I started noticing death everywhere. So in our culture, and in lots of cultures, people are buried on their land. So she was buried in our front yard, and even after she died, we continued to live there, my grandmother and I. And I would have these wild dreams at night, and would just wake up screaming. And I would always go and my grandmother would make me go and stay on her grave and just sort of talk to her. And I just started, I don't know, it was sort of like communing with earth, like touching the ground. And I just started noticing a lot of dead things. Like, just when you stop and actually look around, there's so much death. Like, there are insects that are dead everywhere. Birds die all the time, and you see them. And it just, it became not normal. I mean, I was afraid of death still. It was very frightening, and it still is. But there's sort of like a fascination with that too. I think with this piece, I was kind of grappling with that. That whole thing.
You told me that you would go and lay on her grave and talk to her, and I look at this and I see you becoming the earth almost, and just completely embedded in the earth.
Absolutely.
And this putting your ear to the earth and just listening to what she's telling you. And I find it both visually very beautiful, and emotionally it just really is something that I connect with. And again, I just find you almost disappearing into the earth with this piece.
I felt that way. That's interesting you said that, because I did feel that way, like lying there looking up, especially at night, at the sky, and, wildflowers and wild grass. It's not like, it wasn't a lawn or anything like that. And I remember distinctly, and it's funny because I hadn't thought of this in a long time, but I do remember sort of the feeling, or sort of the hope, the dreaming of, you know what I mean, like falling in with her, like melting into the ground. So that's wild. That memory just came back up for me. I mean, I don't know. I mean, all these things live in our psyches somewhere. So who knows what was coming up when I was making this piece?
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, we think a lot about death in our work.
Yeah.
It's become such a familiar thing, and we're only aware that not everybody thinks about death when we're having conversations with normal people, I guess.
Yeah.
Beautiful details of this piece. I just picked a couple, but really every item, and those are from the Bishop Museum, a lot of them.
Yeah,
right?
a lot of them. I was lucky enough. I reached out to them, and so a lot of basically all the organic matter is sourced from here. So some are from farms, like the jawbone, and then a lot of them are flowers and plants that I picked myself and dried for the piece. And then, the Bishop Museum, God bless the Bishop Museum. They were so generous. You know, I told them about the project and I said, I'm looking for dead things, but a lot of the dead things I was collecting were falling apart, or like by the time I found them were completely like, yeah, and I wanted some more beautiful dead things. So they donated I got so much to work from, and I still have a lot that I use in some works, but so a lot of the insects are from the Pacific, and a lot of them are sort of like, people will send things that they find to them, but if they don't actually have the correct documentation of where they found it, and all of that, when they send it to the bishop, they sometimes keep some of them. So the ones I got didn't have, they were kind of homeless because they didn't have enough information about it to use them properly, so they kind of just had them lying around, and they were kind enough to like give me so much. I mean, they like invited me in, and I got to like, it was a really beautiful moment. Yeah, I so appreciate that. Oh my gosh, I want to. So this piece. Oh my gosh. Okay, so it's interesting because we have the work separated, and there are so many moments I wanted to talk about different parts of your work. So this is the very first piece of Reem's that I saw with my daughter. I mean, I've seen your work before, even before I was pregnant, but this is at the Honolulu Museum of Art. And there was something about the experience of it. So my daughter was I think she was like 3 months old, and we went to Homa and just sort of were walking around. This piece was on display, and she was so drawn to this piece. Like, she was leaning into it, and like we would move her away and she would sort of like arc her body, and you know how babies are sort of like pliable, and like they're like a slinky in that moment, but she was determined to spend more time with this piece, and I love this piece. And there was something about that moment that sort of was like a realization that, because part of what I love about your work, part of what I love about Reem's work is that it just feels so familiar to me. It feels kindred. That's the word I think of. It feels like she's tapped into something unquantifiable, something that you can't touch the edges of. And even when you look at her work, I love paintings, I love painters, but with your paintings, you can't consume it all at once. You have to come back. And when I look, and also I think it's the scale of it too, I come into your paintings and I am sort of trapped in one part of it. And these images don't do it justice because the colors, the way they peek from behind each other. I mean, it's sort of like there's so much about the passage of time in how you paint that tells a story and that moves a person if you feel caught in a moment. And watching my daughter experience this piece and the way she insisted on it at 3 months old made me sort of, it was just realization that a lot of our memories talk about the bones, are in our bones, and you and I talked a little bit about that, and I'm gonna kind of pass it to you about how we hold memory within us and how we pass it on. So even a 3-month-old recognizes something.
Instinct.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you. That's, I always love it when I hear that children react to the work because again, that unspoken, the instinct is so strong with kids. This painting was part of a show titled Beyond the Archive, curated by Heloha Johnston, and at Homa in 2015. And I was very lucky to have worked with Heloha in building the show and the dialogue that went into that, because, you know, there's so much to unpack, but the role of a good curator is to keep you focused. And so this was one of those moments where the piece could have gone into any number of directions. And ultimately, it just kind of painted itself, I think. When you remove yourself out of the equation, the work just happens. And I think that's where instinct comes in, and you're not overly directing the piece. And so this specific painting was the imagery was taken from my grandfather's home in southern Lebanon after the Israelis had withdrawn from southern Lebanon, and this house was occupied by them, and it was left in, you know, a pretty bad shape. So the chairs, the interior, the books, these are all from that photo that I had. The ghost girl materialized all by herself. And so, you know, it's funny how sometimes you just have no explanation for something and it just happens. And at the time, as I was prepping for the show, I was reading Mahmoud Darwish's book, Memory for Forgetfulness, Beirut, 1982. And it was this long book of prose for a cup of coffee. He's begging for 5 minutes of a ceasefire so that he could go to the kitchen and make himself a cup of coffee. So for us Arabs, coffee is sacred. And so I completely understand. And so you will see throughout the painting a very familiar motif for those of us who are Arab or Lebanese specifically, an emblem embedded, a floral pattern that's on all our coffee cups, kind of like how the Simon bowl is here, similar, very recognizable by all of us. And so it was my way of finally making him his cup of coffee. Another important icon is the white glove, and I wanted to juxtapose that with the white dress because that's my last memory of my grandmother. The white glove is something that makes an appearance in my paintings every once in a while, and I thought they would dialogue nicely. A little girl here, a dress, and a white glove. So.
You know, it's also part of what's so powerful about this work. It's interesting that the ghost girl just appeared because, I mean, she's just so stern. You know, the power that she has.
Yeah. You know, it's scary. After I finished painting this, my mother, I sent her a picture, and she said, "That girl looks like your grandmother when she was a young girl."
Oh, wow.
And I didn't even tell my mother what this piece was about.
Yeah.
And so she just said that, and I thought that was really bizarre. I'd never seen a picture of my grandmother as a child. So, yeah. Ooh, okay. All right, so I wanted to show this trailer, and I really would like you to talk about it, Nanci. So do you want to talk about it before or after we look at the trailer?
You decide.
Okay, I'd like to play it because I would like you all to just take a moment and see what the work tells you before you have the attached explanation to it. It's really, I mean, I don't want to diminish this experience by adding words to it, but an observation. So there's this connection, mother to daughter, but there's also the other connection that I am hoping you would also touch upon. You're looking to your daughter, but you're also looking elsewhere. And do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I feel like this is a test. Am I going to say the right thing? Oh my gosh. So the series is called Ijaze. It actually started, the video doesn't do it justice because they're just like a few seconds of lots and lots of videos, lots and lots of performances. So everything started with Cleanse, this whole series. And Cleanse happened as soon as I found out I was pregnant. And then after Cleanse, I felt, it's interesting because it's sort of like the beginning of an advent. It just felt like a whole new series of work that I needed to do. I felt like Cleanse wasn't enough. And so I did a series of performances throughout my pregnancy and then through a big portion of having my daughter. And yeah, so those are just like little snippets of moments, but they're meditative walks, and a lot of what I was thinking about throughout all of the performances was sort of repetition. One of the things that I will share is that one of the things I found out is when a woman is pregnant, if she is pregnant with a daughter, her daughter forms all of her eggs while she's in utero with her mother. And it was when I read this, because I just did so much reading about pregnancy, I wanted to know everything about what was going on in my body. I also had a very difficult pregnancy, so that's a whole other story. But when I found that out, it was sort of a moment of, oh, well, all the parts of my daughter, I mean, like the most important parts about my daughter that I made were inside my mother. And so while my mother was pregnant with me, the foods that she ate, the moods that she was in, every chemical that coursed through her body contributed to me creating my daughter, to me creating my eggs. And it was sort of like so I think of time as like a spiral. We keep doing the same things, we keep coming back to the same places, but we're there, but we're not there each time. And it felt like a piercing through time. In that, oh, they've met each other, intimately even. And yeah, that's the seed that started this series. And in all of the performances, I worked with different videographers, but what was most important was capturing the coming and the going, the duality of it. But it feels like it's simplistically, it feels like a duality, a coming and a going. But there's actually a whole third reality happening, and even more than that. And when I get very emotional, it's hard for me to speak eloquently in English. I'm doing my best. But
we talked about this
earlier.
we
We did. We were like, this may happen. But I don't know if that's enough to explain the sort of the camera on a tripod and the moving camera as well.
That lineage is very empowering. I mean, I as an observer, I look at this and I feel like this is very empowering to have that lineage and that connection.
Yes, absolutely. And I say about my daughter that she's like my mother, like reincarnated.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, she's not, but she is too, and I feel also in mothering her that I repair so much about my own childhood.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? There's sort of like, I don't know, there's so much time travel
Yeah.
in mothering, and there's so much time travel in all of the performances that I've done.
Right.
Because there's the conscious moment, you know, I'm and also part of another inspiration for the work is that I had a vision of my mother when I was a child. When we're back home, I was playing in the woods. I knew she was dead. You know, I lay on her grave at night. But I saw her, and she was in a white dress, and she came to me and looked at me, and I remember I could smell her. That's how real it was. And then she turned and she left, and then I would catch glimpses of her in moments, or I would hope to catch glimpses of her in so many moments. But you know, this is the sort of environment I grew up in. I grew up in a rainforest village, so there was a lot of greenery. In Hawaii, I'm so lucky to be back here and to have been pregnant here and to have had her here. And I feel like in many ways the islands gave me my child because I asked them for it. I did a lot of performances that, you know, are part of the series before I got pregnant because I wanted a child. And there was also a lot of going back into the forest because in animism, you believe that the land is alive, like even rocks are alive and have agency. You know, they're going somewhere. Like a rock in a road is going somewhere. It's not moving as fast as we are. It's not in this dimension, but it's got its own spirit and energy. And so it was very important for me to go back in nature while pregnant, and also to take her and be in the land and ask my mother to come back and visit us, or at least have her feel safe, and also for the child to know what my body does, you know, the chemicals that I release, the pheromones that come out of me when I think of my mom, and to know that she's safe.
Well, I like that you connected it to place, because I'd like to take a moment, and I think both in your culture and mine, this connection to our ancestors is so strong. And Nanci and I were talking about the importance of how, you know, a lot of people perceive Hawaii to be a certain place and a certain resort or escape, but what kept us here and what has drawn us to this place is the fact that we can sense the pain that is our own in a way, and we see that mirroring in place, and that has helped us feel more understood being here. And so when you say that, and when I say that, I've gotten into my work through the lens of what has happened here.
And what is happening here.
What is happening here, what continues to happen here. That is, we don't say this lightly. We say this with the full knowledge of what our ancestors had gone through and what is going on here.
Yes. Yes. Being displaced in place.
Yes, absolutely. Well,
oh my goodness.
I paired these together because I had to.
Yes.
It was just too good of a pairing, and I'm going to show the next slide, and then I'll go back to the first one. So, lessons from a burning house, right? And then the grid is something that stood out for me in that piece, and the grid is very important in my own work. So Nanci's piece is on the right-hand side. My burnt buildings are on the left-hand side. My piece is on the right here, and this is the same one. Tell me a little bit about this piece, because when I read the description, I was so haunted. So I just would like to hear more about it from your perspective.
Oh, sure. So this piece, it's about looking for answers. and not being able to find it. It's about sort of like going through, rummaging through like debris, you know, looking for answers. Oh my gosh, I did so much work while I was pregnant because, like I said, I had a difficult pregnancy, and I was really, and it's also like a deep fear of mine that something will happen to me and my child will grow up without me, because it's like I don't know how, it's a big fear of mine.
I was the same way when my daughter was young.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because there's such a like, when you grow up and you've lost so much,
Yeah.
you know what that feels like, and you also feel like you don't ever want to put that on anybody else.
Yes.
Yeah. And so this piece, I had, you know, part of, when I hit puberty, I had a lot of reoccurring nightmares about a house that was on fire and knowing that my mother was in there somewhere and I had to go get her. And so I would just, it was like these night terrors where I was like breaking through walls, like trying to find, and it was always like there was always a crawl space somewhere I had to find the entrance to because she had to be in there, and I would just be looking for her, like tearing everything apart. And I would always wake up right as the house was like finally everything was collapsing. So it was also just like, I mean, I've been in riots, so you know, I've seen what it looks like when things are burnt down.
Yeah.
There's just this. There's like a familiar. There's like something about that grit, you know, like the chaos of it, fire, you know, the aftermath of fire.
They also feel like prayers, and it
yeah.
also feels like a ritual.
Yeah.
That I mean, I look at this, and there are all these little pockets with hidden messages in there.
Yeah, and you know, this, like I was saying, part of the nightmares got really bad when I was like in puberty, and I really was asking, I wanted answers, you know, I wanted to know what my mom's body was like. I wanted to know, I mean, my body was changing, you know, I was curious, but I had so many questions that I just didn't have any answers for, and I wanted to ask her. And so I kind of, with this work, I went back and I hand wrote all these little things I remember she told me or my grandmother told me, either her or my grandma, because, you know, they both raised me when I was very little. And I wrote them all down and bound them and put them in the little houses. And this brings me to your work too, because I feel like a lot of what you do in a lot of these is like, it's like revisiting the site of, you know, revisiting ground zero, the site of destruction, and searching for answers.
But when we revisit it, it's on our own terms.
Yes, exactly.
And I think that's
exactly
where we have agency.
Yes, absolutely. In the recreation of it.
Yeah.
You know, there's more power in there, and you get to sort of learn something too. At least for me, that's a very important part of it, is like learning something in the process of sort of like recreating the chaos. Yeah.
But there's no helplessness, because when you destroy it, again, you control how far you go.
Yeah.
And I think that's very empowering.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I love this piece of yours. I mean, once I saw it, I immediately was like, oh, I know. Like,
Yeah.
I know the feeling. And do you have an image of the installation?
Oh, it's further down.
Oh, it's further down. Okay, that's fine. We can talk about it then too.
Okay.
But I love the way you installed the work, and we can talk about that. But once you see the image later, it's very powerful.
So you placed
Speaking
these
of which,
two together.
yes,
so
I
I'm
did.
curious about
I did.
about why you chose those two together.
So the first one is August 4th, and as soon as I saw it, I knew. So August 4th of 2020, there was a massive explosion. Reem. And I remember thinking of you as soon as it happened. I think I reached out too, but I don't know. I feel like I think I reached out when this happened. It was just, and this is something that you have in your artist statement that happens with me, where when you have experienced intense trauma and when you have been in absolute chaos and war and riots, scenes of mass destruction, when you see it again, wherever it's happening in the world, like you're immediately back there, like immediately back there. And I was for this explosion. I was watching every single video. I mean, as soon as I saw this painting, when I saw that red cloud, you can see, I don't know if it's as visible, but in the left of the top piece of August 4th, there's this like red plume. I knew immediately because I'd seen that, because I watched so many videos of it. And again, it's like the searching for control of the situation. Like, if I watch it enough times, maybe I can understand how to stop this from ever happening again.
Right.
You know, and how could I? It was so maddening, but there's that impulse.
Yeah.
And again, with your work, part of what, how I had these paired, is you can't consume Reem's paintings in one go.
They're big.
They're massive. And not just that too, they're so full, they're so dense, they're so rich, they're so full of information. And you could just look at this and think, oh, it's just an abstract expressionist piece, and that's not true at all. They're so full of information. And okay, so there's, the news images, and I'll let you, talk more about this in just a moment, but there's sort of that red plume that was instantly recognizable for somebody like me who obsesses over things like that too. Even the white pillars, it just reminded me of that building that.
The silos.
Yeah, the silos, and how it was sort of crumbled at the bottom, but was still sort of crazily intact somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah, after that explosion. And
so the silos took the force of the explosion from one side, and collapsed on one side, and then there was even a person who worked there standing behind the silos on the other side, and he was fine because it was on the other side, and all the buildings that were in that line were spared, even though for days people said that the sound of Beirut was that of glass being swept. And so throughout the piece you have a lot of these small triangular shapes, and you can't really see them all over in the digital image, but it's because I used a special paint called interference. Based on where you're standing, you can either see it or not, but they're little pieces of glass, shards of glass all over. Of course, the symbols of death are evident through the spine on the lower right-hand corner of the painting and the crows on the upper left. Blood. But there were also a lot of people that, the hand is something that comes up in my work quite a bit, and it's symbolic of the act. So there were a lot of people that acted. So you see the hands on the upper upper right-hand corner. It might be hard to see the digital image, but so it had a lot of what I was thinking about. And the reason this piece is 15 feet wide, so it's the largest piece I've done that's not a mural. And I remember waking up that morning and just getting a million messages on my phone and calling my parents to find out what had happened. And my mom was in shock, and she kept saying, "There's no more Beirut." She just kept saying that over and over. And then she said, "This is going to take a big painting." And she was so serious,
Yeah,
she was
knows
so
her
serious.
daughter.
Yeah, that was the first thing that she said after she kept repeating, and of course I wasn't thinking about painting at the time, but that was what she said, and so I thought, okay, I have to make a painting, and so I started this painting 2 weeks later. and so that's what it was. And the spines below it are also, you know, an homage to that in a way.
You know what's interesting is that when I saw this piece, like, I know it's massive because I kind of follow you on Instagram. And if you're not following Reem on Instagram, you are missing out. It's a joy. Like, you always send me through rabbit holes. But so this piece, let's use that, 15 feet wide.
That's right.
And it was done in 2020. So August 4th, this explosion happened. Reem got to work and she finished this painting in 2020. And for me, it sort of harkens back to what happens, I think, like with people like you and I, where you immediately feel like you have to do something. You have to sort of like draw lines around it. You have to like encapsulate it and control it in some way with your work. And yet you go back. It's like the revisiting. That's why I paired it with Seahorse. So the next year, you're still revisiting it.
Yes.
You know? And I love that I see that in your work. It's sort of like a going back to the scene of the crime and trying to like assess it.
Yeah, you can't exactly put these things to rest. It's almost, and that's, I think, where survivor's guilt comes in, because it's almost as if, and I think that's where Western perspectives differ from our perspectives, because I feel like we don't have the luxury of self-care and self-help. It's always about others.
Yeah,
you know,
it's always about everybody.
Yeah, and I'm not saying this in a way to seem insensitive and to say, well, obviously Westerners don't care about others. Not at all. But it's just it's from the lens of, like, we were never exclusive of others to begin with. And so for us, to put something to rest is the death of something. And how could you know, that these people need to be remembered. These issues need to be resolved. And we have to reiterate this through the work in order for, well, we could only hope that these things don't happen again. But as history has shown time and time again, they do happen. But yeah, Seahorse's spines submerged in water, which is a recurring theme for me. Of course, the explosion happened at the ports of Beirut, and so there's that as well. Are you ready?
Am I ready? Oh my goodness. So I paired these two together, Veil of Separation and Touching Eternity. And it's interesting because, you know, we just watched Icheze, where I'm talking about, you know, existing in different, you know, realities at the same time. And I love these paintings. I mean, I love the hand in the painting, but I love the gesture of it. And to me, these two belong together. I have my notes, and there's something that I wrote, which is Reem and the Stars. But really, I think this is the visualization of that for me, that like reaching out to those that are gone, as well as sort of like holding out hope for what could be. And I mean, I want you to talk a little bit more about these two.
No, that's kind of spot on, actually. In Islamic art, the Islamic flower, the decorative arabesque, or floral motifs are symbolic of eternity. And so I like this idea of guiding souls that have left. And this whole series is part of this imagination of, well, where did they go? It's the only way, I think, that you can come to terms with losing someone prematurely, is to imagine scenarios of, well, what if I send them a harpy to guide them on their way? In Islamic art, for example, a harpy is a guide to the soul, and it's a very gentle presence. So that's what this series is about, just allowing them or opening their eyes to this path as they reach the next place. So that's very much what those pieces are about. You put quite a few of mine in succession, so.
I know. We were like, initially said, oh, we'll pick 3 pieces of each.
That's hard.
So, how much time do we have?
How much time do we have?
It's 6:35.
Because,
So,
ooh.
yeah,
So,
sometime for Q&A, but.
okay.
Memory and power.
Yeah.
So do you want me to scroll through the next 2 as well, or?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Because they're kind of in the same.
They are.
vein.
Yeah. And then could you scroll back again, slower? Back to this, okay.
Okay.
So part of what, we've touched a little bit about this, about memory and how powerful it is. I work with memory. I did a lot of work at a point in my life of reaching out to refugees and recording their stories. And I didn't realize until much later in life that I was doing that because I was trying to I was watching them tell their story, but it was also a way for me to kind of figure out how to talk about my stories. And with these pieces, there's something about, because the fear of forgetting people, as well as the going into the studio and actively, erasing the faces. And there's something too about your paintings that for me feel like a moment. It feels like memory. Yeah, this feels like that. When there's a moment, we need more words in the dictionary. We need more words, period. But there is a feeling, if you all take a moment and try to remember someone, but there's that moment before it comes to you where you're sort of floating, you're in limbo. And your paintings, especially these guys, they feel almost, especially this one, the one on the right, it feels almost like it's like that instant before it comes back to you. But the longer it's been sometimes, and there's always this fear, there's always that moment of will I be able to remember? And I feel like your paintings are sort of that, there's that second, but suspended.
That's so interesting that you say that. With those specific pieces, they're titled moribund outlivers. They're basically people who are near death and they've lived past their expiration date, and they're war survivors. And so the war survivor has long since died, and me being one of them, I think that when you think of the concept of joy, it's very hard to come by for people like us, I think, so easily, because, again, how could it? And these pieces represent the state of hysteria that the survivor often finds himself in. And we were talking earlier to Daniel and about his sculptures and his heads, and he mentioned that they were like demons. And I would say for me, these pieces are probably the hardest I've ever done, because I feel like I have to channel a state of hysteria for that momentary burst. So that fleeting thing that you're talking about, I have to tap into it very briefly, but I can't stay for very long. And the mark has to channel itself to create the form of the head. And so and it's difficult. It's difficult to have the head emerge without forcing and dictating features on it, and have it say something.
Yeah, I think one of the strongest things too is that you know when to stop.
Not always.
I think you do.
Not always.
I think you do it very well.
So, should we scroll to yours, or?
I mean, I think these are both about power. So these are from Reem's Instagram, and this is her studio, and this is a series that you're working on.
Yeah.
But what really, why I chose this is because the work is in progress too, but is that the power that comes from recreating it, because I think this is from 2021, and for me it was sort of like you took a body and you put it down on your studio table, and then you just started pulling the pieces of it out. But I mean, you're talking
My
about
daughter's body. So
Oh, wow.
she's almost 18, so she grumbles a little every time I ask her to do this, but she lays flat and I do a tracing of her body, and when the body doesn't make full contact with the paper, you end up with very strange distortions, a very small waist, a very small head, and so I decided to keep those distortions and work with them. And the body in my work has always been representative of, or has been a stand-in for the city of Beirut and the assault that it has experienced. And so the assault happens on this paper with watercolor, a medium that I've always greatly disliked, but thought that if I'm going to work with it, I want to try something different for me. And the pigment that I'm using is so strong, it's quite beautiful, and so the color of blood is really the color of blood.
Yeah.
But that helps me segue into your piece, because I think, so you got the caption from my Instagram, and I had written the operating table,
Yes,
is
that's
that
what you
right?
said, yeah.
Okay, so that's interesting, because I
my
paired
gosh.
it with your piece, Anarcha, which is so perfect, the pairing of the two
Yeah, it
pieces.
was really good. Yeah, good
so-
job. Good job. So she just put this on. This may seem very we spent time with this, but you just added this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Less than an hour ago.
Less than an hour ago, yeah. I just, Nanci was somewhere, and I just added a few images. Please
Yeah, so
tell
this
me.
piece is inspired by the story of Anarcha, who is a slave woman whose body the speculum was developed on. So the speculum is the device that all women know when you go in for your gynecological test. It's inserted in you and used to pry you open so your doctor can check you. So it's something that all of us women at some point have had an intimate experience with. So this is while I was in grad school in 2010, I found out about this woman that she had a fistula, which is a tear in her womb, and she was basically given up to this doctor to experiment on, and he performed over 30 surgeries on her. And the speculum was developed as he was trying to figure out how to fix a fistula, which is the tear. And he needed a way to keep her open because he operated on her so much. And he not only would try different threads, he would make cuts into her and sew her up. And she would lay on a table without any anesthesia. And she just experienced this. This happened to her. And this was in 2010, so now there's more about her, but I found out about this sort of by happenstance. One of my professors was reading the biography. One of my professors from undergrad was reading a biography of the Dr. J. Marion Sims, and she happened to run into the story about Anarcha, and then I was immediately fascinated with it. And there's something about objects I mean, they all have energy, yes, but there's something about experiencing an object that was developed on somebody else's body in such a brutal way. And there's also something about, and this is why I say that my work is in that liminal space between experience and language. There's something about saying, oh, I've had the speculum used on me, and I know about this woman's story, and there's something about experiencing it. So I was very curious about, I didn't feel like I could talk about her if I didn't lay down on a table and have people cut, not into my body because, no,
Yeah.
but into an undergarment that I had on. And of course, I haven't crossed the threshold to her experience, but in the attempting it, I felt I would be able to speak more about her. And again, there wasn't much about her. There was just the mention of her in Sims's biography, and then in the subsequent illustrations of his work, all the bodies that were illustrated were white bodies and not her body. And so she was completely erased from the story of it. And so yeah, I performed this in 2010. A friend of mine built a table, and then I invited 30 women to come and cut into my undergarment and sew it up. But before that, we all did the language part, where we all went and we did a lot of reading about it. We spent time together talking about it, a lot of ruminating about it, and then everybody had their little packets, and they came up and they on that day cut into me and sewed. And then in a way I felt like we had sort of, the 30 surgeries, I mean, even the duration of it, 30 people coming and cutting and sewing. And it was just, they were like little sews and, little cuts and little things like that. But it kind of helped expand the knowledge, the true knowledge of a woman laying on her back in the backyard we weren't under the stars, but like just in the sky, and having somebody pry her open and cut into her over 30 times. So
Yeah, and we have a follow-up to that, but first, and I know that we should
I don't know.
probably wrap
Are
up,
you
but,
like
Yeah,
in a? Because
if you want to wrap up, and then we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A.
Okay.
for Q&A.
Yeah.
So, we could really go
Yeah.
on and on
We really could.
in terms of the interchangeability of the assault on the body and on the city.
Yes. And there's a phrase that kept coming up for me, speaking of language, when I was looking at your work intimately and putting this this presentation together, was it just kept coming up, and it's closer now to the experience of it all, or different iterations of the same thing, like closer now to the experience of it all. So
I can't believe we haven't collaborated.
but yeah. But even with these pieces where Reem is putting bullets on the surface of the work, I think there's that sort of drive you and I both have to how do we really express it? How do we?
Well, early on, you're completely unapologetic, right? And you're very narrative in the work. Not you specifically, but in general, when you're working through an idea. So I feel like I allowed myself to do things like that, which I probably don't feel the need as much to do. But it's a little bit of, it's in your face, you need to see this. You need to be confronted
Absolutely.
with this.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's a little bit of that in both of our work.
Absolutely.
This, again, not apologizing. Should we conclude with today's pictures?
Sure. I love that you put that.
Yeah.
Put that in there.
So,
Yeah, so we went to Pu'uhonua, and I mean, it's interesting because, again, you said this in the beginning about how, and I recognized this immediately, even the first time I came to Hawaii, is that there is a healing energy there's a healing that can happen here. And I think a lot of people come to this land to sort of like heal themselves.
Yeah.
But then in the process, they leave so much debris here, psychically.
Yeah.
And I'm a very physical person. I feel a lot of things in my body, and I know you are too, which is why you're so kindred.
Yes.
But we were talking about how Pu'uhonua, as soon as you walk into that space, there's a weight.
It's very heavy. I mean, we could feel it today. Just, yeah, it was very, very intense and very present.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just love how they transition into one another, both pieces. And then this is the last image, looking at these pieces and then the cascading marks as well.
And all the history too.
Yeah, I mean, it was a place of second chances, which ultimately I think is what the work allows us to have, is a second chance to reckon with our histories. So I think we could end it there.
That's so true. I think that's such a beautiful way because like we don't really give ourselves that a lot of times. Those second chances. We're gonna open it up for questions for folks here, and then Miho's gonna come around to see if there are questions or comments from our online attendees. But starting it here, does anyone have any questions or comments for Nanci or Reem?
Daniel.
So it's interesting because seeing your work, I mean, as a painter, your brain works a little bit different. And I'm curious to understand your approach, for example, on your destruction paintings. Do you instinctively board them, or do you pre-plan them, like on a sketch as to this is how it's going to develop, and then from there let it take you, as opposed to the ones of memory and power that was more instinctive in a way, that you let go your state of hysteria, as you mentioned, which seems like it's interesting because they're like different approach, right? To the
Well, I mean, this piece, which is in there, is definitely a little bit more planned, marginally more planned, not a lot. I'm not a fan of over-planning. This guttural response to the work is so important to me. The role of instinct is so important to me. When I start a painting, I spend a lot of time physically touching the surface because I feel like I have to have this dialogue with the surface. And I have to feel the surface and feel the needs of the surface. And that's why they're so large, because I want to be embedded in the surface. And it's instinct all the way, and it's response all the way. And then, of course, it's removing yourself out of the equation after a while so that you know what the piece needs. So that's the best way I could answer it. It's definitely not pre-planned. Yeah.
I'm sure you discover things as well after you finish.
Absolutely. It's the best teacher, being in the studio is the most important thing. That's how you have your answers. question.
I guess I have
Quick question for Nanci. So in the earlier video, your daughter was part of it. What did she think of it?
That's a good question. So I wasn't sure when the series would end, the recordings of us. And I did know that as soon as she was conscious enough to tell me what she thought, that we would move from there. And she doesn't like being recorded without her permission. And she's a very strong person. So we got to a point where she was just sort of no, don't record me. I mean, even before she could really, she was speaking when we got to that point, but she would just sort of just stare at you, stop it. And so we stopped, but she, in terms of the work itself, I think she finds it interesting. As I said, I didn't grow up talking about my mom. I didn't even have a photo of her. The first photo of her I had, I think it was right when I turned, it was around, it was the summer before I turned 21, when I traveled to Rome to visit her sister, and I got a photograph of her. So in all that time, I didn't have any photos of her. And again, as I said, I was really terrified of losing my child. I still am. Of losing myself, of passing and my child growing up without me. So I really wanted to document us together. As part of also the documenting us while she was still in utero, and afterwards. And so we look at the work. We have some in our home, and I think the best part about it is that she is so comfortable talking about my mom. She'll say things like, "Oh, I miss your mom," and it's just it's everything. Yeah, it's everything, because it's sort of like she's alive again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We want to see if we have any online.
Yeah, Miho, is there anybody? Oh, nothing online. Well, Tara's, oh no, go. Oh, no, sorry. Tara's great question. I was thinking of you. Reem's daughter just graduated from high school. And, I know parents always want to make better for their own kids and their lives. How, I don't know, and I know I've never met your daughter, but I know you guys are very close, How have conversations about your heritage been shared, along her life and connection?
The guilt never ends, because I feel like she's definitely inherited a lot of that burden and the sadness. She wants to major in Middle Eastern studies with a minor in Arabic, and she feels very responsible for everything that's going on in the Middle East, and she feels like she wants to help fix it. And the weight of responsibility is great. And it comes with a lot of sadness. And so she definitely has a lot of that. And add that to the blender and mix it with a 17-year-old who's trying to be a normal 17-year-old, and you end up with something very interesting. But yeah,
That's really beautiful to have those connections, learning more about ourselves by learning about our families and about our cultures.
absolutely.
Anyone have any other comments they want to share? I see Hiroki. but I don't want to point him out. I'm just kidding. Well, I invite you. Yeah. Please, please.
I think it's so beautiful how your work has evolved through time and kind of seeing the process and journey of that and how it's changed, but also like probably had a common thread and that you want to speak to anything about how your process has changed over time.
Is that for me or? I think, Reem is right, a lot of what I did in undergrad, even before that, when I think about, because I was interviewing refugees even in high school, I went to a math and science academy. It was a boarding school, and we would tutor kids that were living in these kids in the middle of the city in Chicago, and I used that. We would sort of get trained in, and I would do some tutoring, and then I would go and volunteer at different refugee centers, and then I think the whole process has really been about me coming closer and closer and closer now to being able to talk about myself. So I think that there was I think a lot of everything I've done, and I think what I'm doing now too is research for what comes next. And I don't really know what comes next, but I enjoy that asking. There's a child.
This is what comes next.
This is what comes next. What an entrance it would have been. Did you want to say something about that too, about your process?
In some ways it's all connected. It's all just one continuous stream of consciousness. But I think definitely it's amazing. I've been at this for 25 years. I started when I was 18 and 19, and I'm still. So it's just very hard to say because I still feel like I'm such a baby in the development of all of it. Because, we were having this conversation earlier about how some people would say that painting is dead, and I was joking that, well, that's a very 90s argument. And then I was saying that, when people say that, they have no clue what they're talking about, because obviously anyone who's painted understands that it's such a rich process that continues to give you questions more than it gives you answers, and that the more immersed in the practice you are, the more of a juvenile you realize that you are, and that you have a long way to go, which is what keeps me going back to the studio time and time again. It's so exciting to do this, and because the search doesn't end.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, yes.
I just wanted to say regarding Nanci's work, the piece that it was displayed here, and I really appreciated now having context, seeing the first thing you showed in the pictures when you're washing the buildings,
Yes.
and thinking that, you're washing your child, and how beautiful it is to have that closure and closing that loop. And it's just really I'm feeling really overwhelmed about it, but I'm excited to follow through with Reem's work as well and see what brings you closure and how are you feeling. And obviously the art making itself, but I'm just really excited to follow through.
Yes, so am I.
Is there closure now?
I don't have closure.
I don't think there's
so
closure. I think it's that spiral. I think once we think we're closing. We're actually just we're still looping. Yeah. So I'm not sure that there's closure.
Yeah.
I think we're searching for it, but I think there's also sort of freedom in accepting that there is
No closure.
no closure. There is no repairing some things. They just stay broken.
Yeah. On that depressing note.
We'll bring it back.
Video that you showed us, if you had posted anywhere online where we could take a look at it.
Oh, sure.
Website, right?
Yeah, so you can find a lot of things on my website, nanciamaka.com. And then I have a Vimeo. So, we were talking about this too earlier about how I'm a terrible arts administrator for myself. But also part of loving myself and respecting myself is the recognition and acceptance that I'm not going to be a good arts administrator, and so I'm so sorry I don't have an arts administrator. I mean, my website has quite a bit of stuff. Like, I actually spent time and like put things on there. But yeah, I'm so sorry. That's the thing I'm not very good at, is the managing of the archives and the presenting of it.
Takes time.
Oh my God, it's a different career. It's a whole other thing. This is why there are curators and archivists and all that stuff. Like, I respect those people and what they do, and I know that I'm not built for it.
Thank you.
Let's give them your